to introduce our featured speaker of the conference, Timothy Cardinal Dolan.
He's just getting started.
I've got 5 more pages to go. Hold your applause to the end, please. Cardinal Dolan traces his roots to the Midwest and the St. Louis baseball Cardinals. Now let's hear from the Twins fans. So St. Louis Cardinal territory, and also, as you know, Budweiser territory. He and I held similar roles in the Apostolic Delegation in Washington, D.C. Obviously, we have taken different paths since then. I'm very fortunate, obviously, to be here in the Diocese of Des Moines. Cardinal Dolan served as rector of the North American College in Rome, auxiliary bishop of St. Louis, and Archbishop of Milwaukee, and now as Archbishop of New York. He also recently completed a 3-year term as president of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Cardinal Dolan is a consummate communicator. Pope Francis, in his apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, stated, "Today's vast and rapid cultural changes demand that we constantly seek ways of expressing unchanging truths in a language which brings about their abiding newness." With closeness to his people, with wit, charm, and abundant humor, Cardinal Dolan fulfills his apostolic calling in New York, which St. John Paul II described as the world's capital. He does so, obviously, with great zest. A very heartfelt welcome to Des Moines and Christ Our Life Conference to you, my friend, Cardinal Dolan.
My, oh my. Bishop Pates, what gracious words. Thank you. You could have gone on forever. Which your people tell me you often do. It is, I renew what I said to you when I had the honor of presiding at the Holy Sacrifice of the Mass. I'm the one who's grateful, folks. I'm the one for whom this is a high honor and a deep joy. I love doing this, and I especially enjoy getting back here to the Midwest. How proud you should be here in the Diocese of Des Moines, and I mean that very much. I'm a student of American Catholic history, and it's a tenet, it's a principle of American Catholic history that great things in the Catholic Church in the United States usually start in the heartland. They usually start in the Midwest. And as proud as I am to be Archbishop of New York, I got to tell you something. I don't think we could pull something like this off in New York. You all are an inspiration to us, and I congratulate you, this diocese. My, oh my. I know now how Jesus must have felt after he fed the 5,000. And I was after Mass, and I just sat back at that time of Thanksgiving and looked at all of you returning to your chairs after receiving our Lord in Holy Communion. And I thought, this must be how Jesus felt after feeding all those thousands of people with all of you here today. So welcome. Thank you for the honor of being with you. Bishop Bates is right. I am from St. Louis, Missouri, the home of the St. Louis Cardinals. Bishop Bates and I agree on a lot of stuff, not about baseball teams. When I was named a Cardinal, when the New York press said to me, did you always want to be a Cardinal? And I said, yeah, Stan Musial. I wasn't thinking of Cardinal Archbishop of New York. When I did my doctoral dissertation, everybody, I wrote about a man named Edwin Vincent O'Hara, who would come to be the founder of something called the National Catholic Rural Life Conference. And that's here in Des Moines, the Catholic Rural Life movement. And the heartland has always been the spring from which many magnificent movements within Catholic life in the United States flow. And I'd like to think that what you're doing here in the Diocese of Des Moines with this Christ Our Life Fall Conference is going to be one of those. We just heard in the Gospel how when the seed of God's Word falls on good soil, there is nothing that can stop its growth. And I trust that what you're doing here in Des Moines is going to do that throughout the Catholic Church in the United States. You all came to great international attention, and I know there's, even though this is a beautifully young group, this diocese came to the attention of the world on the Feast of St. Francis of Assisi, 1979. Right, Bishop Bates and Bishop Sharon? Was it? Yeah. When you had the visit of the man whom we now venerate as a saint, when Pope John Paul II came to the Diocese of Des Moines, particularly to highlight the heartland and what the heartland of the United States, the Midwest, has meant, yes, to the Catholic Church in the United States, but also to the Church Universal. And I was very moved before I was coming out here to speak, as Bishop Sharon and Bishop Bates and I were making our way here to see at Eucharistic Adoration Chapel and to see a chapel where the Sacrament of Penance with dozens and dozens of priests to hear confessions throughout the day. And it reminded me of a great story, perhaps you've heard it, that apparently when a helicopter was coming in over the, what do they call that area where the Mass was? Living History Farms, and John Paul II looked down to see a crowd of 350,000 people. And there, throughout the huge crowd, obviously, what are you going to see with Johnny's on the spot? And a lot of them, okay? A lot of them, okay? And apparently, as Pope John Paul II looked down and saw all the lines outside the Johnny's on the spot, he said, look at the people going to confession. Oh well, anyway, it's clear to me the esteem and the love that you have for your own Bishop Bates, and I share that. You need to know I've known and admired him for a long time, and I especially appreciate the leadership he gives us at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. You know, we elected him to one of our most delicate and important committees. He's the chair of the Bishops' Committee on International Issues and Questions, which, as bishops, of course, our solicitude is, for the dioceses, yes, for the Catholic Church in the United States, but for the Church Universal. So we want to be attuned to what's happening throughout the world. So that committee is one of the premier committees, and we've elected Bishop Bates, and he's provided sterling leadership. Just got back from a visit with brother bishops to the Mideast. And you know what's going on there. So Bishop Bates, thank you, not only for your leadership here in this splendid Diocese of Des Moines, but for the leadership that you give to the country in your role as on the International Committee. And I was hoping, when I saw Bishop Bates this morning, I said, is Bishop Sharon going to be able to be here? And was I ever happy when he came, because our love and gratitude for him is high. I told him today that I share one of his lines. when he was your bishop, he had a great line that he told me that I often use it. He was raising money, as we bishops are stuck doing a lot, and he would invite people to his house for dinner. And he wanted to be up front with them from the beginning, that he says, the bishop's pasta cost you. And now I'm engaged in a huge project to repair and restore our wonderful St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, and I've often used that line, Bishop Sharon. So I learned a lot from you, and that was one of the good ones. Two New York stories. One, talking about St. Patrick's Cathedral. When I got to New York, it's so magnificent, and it's the icon of New York. Everybody knows about St. Patrick's. And when I got there, there was an ecumenical group that greeted me, and they came to my house for breakfast. And at the end of the breakfast, the Methodist pastor of Christ Church on Park Avenue in Manhattan stood up to give me a toast. And this pastor of Christ Church Methodist on Park Avenue, he said, "Archbishop Dolan, I am very jealous of you." I said, "Uh-oh." He said, "Yes." He said, "I had a benefactor, a Methodist benefactor from Philadelphia, take the train up and to give me a check for $1 million. And when he got off the train in Penn Station, he said to the cabbie, 'Take me to Christ Church.'" So he says the cabbie took him to St. Patrick's. And the man knew it, and he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, driver. I asked you to take me to Christ Church. This is St. Patrick's Cathedral." And the cabbie, God bless him, turned around and said, "Listen, Buster, I don't know much about religion. All I know in New York, this is where Christ lives." I made the guy Monsignor. Now the other story, folks, see the press in New York isn't always that good to me. They're always wanting gossip and stuff. So yesterday, of course, my schedule was kind of public, and they knew I was coming to Iowa. So the headlines yesterday in the New York Daily Post, "Dolan going to Iowa to campaign to be president." So actually, I've got another speaker to join with me in this talk. Hillary Clinton, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I had to call the editor, who's a friend of mine, when I got to the airport, and I said, "Colin, I'm not going to Iowa to run for president. I lost an election in the Sistine Chapel a year and a half. I am a has-been. Okay? And I know, there you got it again, the New York press, see, they thought I had a chance to win that election. And I kept trying to tell them I didn't, and I will still, you know, I told them I have about as much chance of being elected Pope as I do as appearing on the cover of Sports Illustrated. Swimsuit edition. But anyway, now, that brings up what I'd like to talk to you about. You didn't think I'd get down to business. I understand I got about 40 minutes, and here's what I thought I'd talk about. Christ our life, that's your theme here, and how much better can you get than that? How much more timely or pertinent can we get with that? We as Catholics believe that Christ shares his life with us in a lot of different ways. He's doing it right now. He does it in his holy word. He does it at the altar. He does it through the sacraments. He does it through friendship. He does it through families. He does it through bishops, priests, and deacons. He does it through our wonderful women and men religious, so many of whom are here. He does it through the splendid and colorful, incredible lay leadership that is flourishing in great dioceses such as this. He does it through the saints. He does it through sacred scripture. But one of the ways that we Catholics believe that Jesus uniquely and powerfully shares his life with us is through the gift of the Pope. The Pope. Our Holy Father is always a unique vehicle of sharing Christ our life. Now, I'm not going to give you a theological treatise on the Pope, but what I thought I would do is this. I would propose to you today that in memory, the popes that we have had recently have been particularly cogent, credible vehicles of Christ our life. And I'm speaking about Pope St. John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis. Those three popes have been genuine gifts to the church in bringing Christ our life to the world. And what I'd like to do for the next 40 minutes or so is speak to you about each of those three popes. Now, I've got a little, now I'm not saying there aren't others, are there ever? We've had our share of lemons in the church in our 2,000-year history. The first one wasn't all that good when you think about it, Pope Peter, okay? But the last three that we've had have been gems. And what I'd suggest to you is that an easy way to understand them is this: soul, mind, and heart. Let me talk a couple minutes about John Paul II and propose to you that he rekindled the soul of the church. Benedict XVI, the mind of the church, and now Francis is working on the restoration of the heart of the church. Is that okay? Yeah. Well, if it wasn't, I don't know what I was going to do. Okay? All right. Soul, head, heart. John Paul II, Benedict XVI, Francis. We start with John Paul II. When John Paul II was elected in 1978, October 16th, Billy Graham said he will be a providential prescription for humanity's exhausted soul. Humanity's exhausted soul. When he visited Washington, D.C. on the same trip that would take him here to the diocese of which you are so legitimately proud, when he visited the White House, the president at the time, Jimmy Carter, said, you, John Paul II, are the soul of the world. When I was Archbishop of Milwaukee, we got people here from Wisconsin, huh? And we got people here from Missouri. We got people from Iowa, right? We got people here from New York. Yeah. Illinois too? Wow. Boy, oh boy. Anyway, when I was in Milwaukee, there was a group of rabbis who were going to see John Paul II in the latter years when he was failing. And a newsman said to Rabbi Shapiro, why are we going to see the Pope? He's a broken, dying man. He said, we're not going to see his body, we're going to see his soul. This is the man, John Paul II, in his 27 inspired years, the successor of St. Peter, who would restore the soul of the church. Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and everything else will come in its place. That was the motto, that was the mission statement of St. John Paul II. What he was saying, he would make his own the words of the psalm. Only in God is my soul at rest. Take care of the soul, John Paul would tell us, and everything else was going to work out. Now, one of the reasons, when he came to the throne of Peter in 78, we had a world, we had even a church that was spiritually exhausted. We had been through a lot. So he set himself to restore the fatigued soul of the church. Now, he could do this exceptionally well because he himself bordered on being a mystic. You know what a mystic is? Most of us will have to wait for heaven, for union with God. We get glimpses of it here on earth periodically. Some of us are lucky in prayer and the sacraments or at a moment of particular insight to sense an intimacy with the Lord. But all of us admit that those occasions are few and far between. John Paul II, though, probably was a mystic, where this union to which we all aspire was something ordinary for him. If you ever had the privilege of assisting at his daily Mass in his little chapel, where each day about 24 people would be able to come in as he offered 7 o'clock Mass. I'm sure Bishop Sharon and Bishop Pates had the honor, as did I. When you would go into the little chapel, there he was at his prelude in prayer, where he had been for over an hour, and you would see that he was locked in prayer. And as you sat down to wait for Mass to start, you could hear him groan and sigh. And sometimes you would see tears, sometimes you would see a smile. And you could sense that this was a man in touch with the divine. This was a man the life of whose soul was beaming over with Christ our life, the theme of our conference. Now, where did this come from? Well, he himself was a student of St. John of the Cross, the great Carmelite saint, who was one of our mystics, okay? So he kind of was very interested in mystical spirituality from the beginning. But you'd probably agree with me that where he got this deep, deep interior life, Christ our life vibrant within, the soul, was he absorbed it from the high-octane Polish Catholicism and culture from which he came. You see, Poland is a Catholic culture on steroids, right? And he would grow up on this. Catholicism was part of everything. There was not a spiritual and a worldly life. There was one life, Christ our life. You see, the life of the soul bore fruit and spilled over to our public life. And this was the Poland in which John Paul II grew up. But, and here's what I want to say to you, it was a Poland whose soul had been gravely tested. Karol Wojtyła was born in 1920 when Poland had been decimated by World War I. You know that on the maps, Poland had been wiped off the face of the maps, only to be restored by the Versailles Treaty. Poland had been decimated. And he grew up in that destruction, in that decimation of post-World War I Poland. He himself lost everything. His mother he could barely remember. His sister died when he was young, very close to his father, only to walk home in his late teens and to find him dead one day on the floor. His brother, the physician, he was very close to his older brother, who died again when Karol was a teenager as a physician, as he caught the dreaded virus and dealing with sick people. So this was a man who by his early 20s had nothing, no family, nothing of earthly value except his soul, except his faith, except Christ our life. And then you know what happened on September 1st, 1939, as he looked up and recalled falling to the ground in tears as he watched with the rest of Poland as the Luftwaffe came over and as Nazism enveloped Poland. So Poland went through the horrors of 6 years of Nazi tyranny. Karol Wojtyła would see his friends arrested, especially his Jewish friends. He recounted once that the young man who would serve Mass with him, he wasn't a priest yet, clandestinely in the catacombs of St. Stanislaw Cathedral, the next morning would not be there, had been arrested during the night. He himself coming back in the middle of the night from the chemical plant where he worked, the factory, to be hit by a truckload of drunken Nazi soldiers and left for dead at the side of the road. This was the Poland that added to the sense of nothingness in this life. No wonder you have a young man who would cling to the life of the soul. And then, as the Nazis are defeated, Poland loses the war a second time. As Nazi jackboots are replaced by the jackboots of Stalin, and as communism takes over Poland until 1988. 39. All right? Is it any wonder that you would have a man who would say, only in God is my soul at rest. In Him alone is all my hope. Is it any wonder that he would so often take consolation in the words of Jesus, do not fear those who can destroy your body, fear those only who can take away the life of the soul. Is it any wonder that his first words on the balcony of St. Peter's, that glorious October 16th, 1978, is simply, be not afraid. This was a man who, from an earthly point of view, had every reason in the world to be scared to death. And yet this was a man who exuded confidence and courage because Christ, our life, was vibrantly alive within his soul. To restore that soul became the objective of his papacy. How did he do it, everybody? How did he do it? Well, a lot of ways. He took Jesus seriously, who said, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. He took seriously the first of the 10 commandments. I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt not have strange gods before me. Seek God first, and he believed that this God was incarnate in Jesus Christ. The primacy of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ comes first. Christ is our life. Jesus Christ is the answer posed, but the answer posed by the question every human life asks, as John Paul II would say. The centrality of Jesus, who is alive in the arms of his mother Mary, who is alive in the sacraments of the church, who is alive in the most holy Eucharist, who is alive in the faces of the poor, who is alive in the church. All right? This is Jesus Christ, who is our Lord, the way, the truth, and the life, putting him first, seeking first his life, seeking first the kingdom of Christ. That is the restoration of the exhausted soul of the church. To tell us, as I mentioned in my sermon at Mass this morning, to tell us that when we put God first, that enhances human dignity, that the human person is made in God's image and likeness, that every time God looks at one of us, he sees the face of his only begotten Son, Jesus Christ, that human life has dignity and purpose and can never be violated by any of the horrors that plague contemporary society, the horrors that he himself had to live through in Poland. Confidence coming on who we are as children of God, redeemed by Jesus Christ, his Son, who we are, not by what we got or what we do or how we function or what we achieve, but as who we are. Okay? God's children in the likeness of Christ. So there's the first way he did it, folks, the primacy of Jesus Christ. The second way he did it was, well, the word that best describes it is the word that he made a kitchen table word, not just in Poland, but throughout the world. And you know the word I'm looking for. The word is solidarity. Solidarity. And the best way to understand that, everybody, is to go back to the first 10 days of June in 1979. That's even before he came here to Des Moines, when he went back to Poland. Something he thought he'd never be able to do. 9 days to change the world. 9 days that Henry Kissinger says John Paul II did for Poland what Winston Churchill did for England in the Second World War. 9 days that Mikhail Gorbachev would later say they knew were the beginning of the end of the communist tyranny. 9 days to change the world. What happened? For 9 days, John Paul II toured almost every alley, every road, every street in Poland. 2/3 of the country came to see him. And he was shrewd enough to know what would happen, okay? He was shrewd enough to know that the Polish people, whose glorious culture, whose vibrant faith, whose rich history had been stomped upon, were going to suddenly, for the first time probably since the Franco-Prussian War, stand up, raise their heads, and look around and say, we're not alone. We're not by ourselves. We are not a cog in a machine. We are not some number in some totalitarian collectivity. We are not an animal. We are not some wheel in some well-oiled machinery. We have a name. We have one another. We have a culture. We have a legacy. We have a history. We have a faith. We have a church. We have a soul. They were able to sense that as they came together, all coming to a crescendo on the final day of John Paul in Warsaw. 2 million people gathered for Mass in Victory Square, and a victory it was. And as John Paul II looked out and began to preach, will you remember what happened? A chant begins to arise from the corner. The tens of thousands of communist troops come to alert because they were worried something would happen. And they were ready to crush any type of political rebellion. But what chant started to come from the crowd? 3 words. 3 words. Started in the corner. It swept the crowd like a wave at Yankee Stadium or Bush Stadium, okay? And not at the Twin Stadium. They never have anything to cheer about, right? It started, and before long, 2 million people are chanting these 3 words. It went on for 30 seconds. It went on for a minute. After 2 minutes, the Pope's secretary, master of ceremonies, came up and said, Holy Father, perhaps you want to calm them down. And he looked at him and said, are you nuts? That's what I came for. John Paul II had not mentioned the word communism. He had said nothing political. He had not talked about Karl Marx or any philosophy or any politics or economics. And 2 million people at the top of their voice for 11 minutes are yelling 3 words, we want God. We want God. We want God. That's what Poland was saying. The country rose up and said, we want God. No wonder John Paul smiled and said, finally somebody gets it. All right? And solidarity was born as a nation came together. That's what the church is. That's what the family is. That's what our parishes are. That's what we are personally. That's what our dioceses are. Us standing together to say, we want God. The soul of Poland was restored as John Paul II did nothing but remind them of their human dignity, the sacredness of human life, that they had an eternal destiny, that they were together as God's children in the family of the church. We want God. Poland's never been the same. The world has never been the same. So we got the primacy of Christ, solidarity, and we finally got everybody with John Paul II's restoration of the soul would be the example of his own suffering. We watched him die, and he let us watch him die. When I was Archbishop of Milwaukee one Sunday morning after Mass, a young couple came up and said, oh, we were married yesterday. I said, oh, congratulations. We're on our way to the honeymoon. I said, where are you going? They said, Rome. I said, oh. I said, will you be there Wednesday? Yeah. Well, you could meet John Paul II if you want. If you bring your marriage license at the general audience, you'll be brought up to meet him with the other newlyweds. And she was ecstatic. He didn't seem all that happy. He said, I thought maybe you'd help us with some restaurants. I said, I do that too. So anyway, I found out where they're staying. I faxed the request. I didn't know what happened until 2 weeks later. I see them. And they were both beaming, and they said, Archbishop Dolan, thanks, we got to see the Holy Father. And it was he that was beaming. I said, what moved you so much? I said, what moved you at the audience or meeting John Paul? He said, was it the size of the enthusiasm of the crowd? No. I said, was it the different languages? He said, no. I said, what moved you? He said, well, thanks to you, we had a good seat. We could see, he said, we can see John Paul very close. And he said, John Paul started to speak. And after about 20 seconds, I saw him reach into his pocket and get his handkerchief out. And he wiped his mouth because he was drooling. He said, I was so moved to see the Pope drooling. In his weakness, in his suffering, in his frailty, in his drooling, he taught us again the wisdom of the cross and the power of the resurrection. That our value comes from not how strong or handsome or rich or productive we are, but as who we are as children of God. Will we ever forget the last Easter? Will we ever forget the last Easter? Remember? 500,000 people in St. Peter's Square. He couldn't have Mass. But at least they hoped that he would come to the window, and sure enough, he did. They wheeled him up. Remember? The world watched, and he went to read his Easter address, and he couldn't speak. Remember? And you could see him agonizing, trying to speak. He was contorted. He was twisted. You could see the frustration. And so finally, he just kind of looked out, and he just raised his hand and gave his blessing. And I thought to myself, it's over. The role of Peter is to proclaim the resurrection. He was unable to do it. Then I caught myself. He did it more powerfully than ever. And of course, the following Saturday, he died. Following Saturday, he died. This was the restoration of the soul that John Paul II accomplished so beautifully. Do you remember? I live near Broadway. I don't go to many Broadway shows. One that I do like is Les Miserables. I don't know if you've seen it. You probably have. Probably because it's one of the few musicals in the world where a bishop comes off looking halfway decent. Remember what happened? Jean Valjean, the star, had stolen the silverware, and the police caught him, and they bring him back from the bishop's house after the bishop had been good to him, and the police bring him back, and with the silverware, they're ready to arrest him, and the police kind of chuckle and say, this vagrant says that you gave him the silverware. And the bishop looked at the policeman and said, well, he's right, I did. And so the police left. And then the bishop gives Jean Valjean kind of a good talking to. And as Jean Valjean leaves and he sings that beautiful that song, remember what Jean Valjean said? He, the bishop, told me I had a soul. He told me I had a soul. That's what St. John Paul II did for the church and the world. How about Benedict XVI? What John Paul II did for the soul, Benedict XVI does for the noggin. Okay? He does for the mind. He does for reason. Benedict XVI powerfully reminded us that faith and reason, brain and soul are buddies. They're not enemies. That is an extraordinarily important lesson in a culture where the new atheism is on steroids and does its best to reduce faith and religion to a silly, superstitious, outdated hobby at best, or to an obnoxious, vicious, oppressive regime at worst. Benedict will remind us that our reason, our brain, and human progress has no better friend than the faith. And faith and reason are buddies. And in doing so, he will restore the intellectual wattage of the church. Now, how did he do it? I mentioned a couple of ways John Paul restored the soul. How did Benedict restore the mind of the church? Well, one, he didn't. This isn't the word he used, but it's the word we can use as we look back with gratitude through what's being called affirmative orthodoxy. Have you ever heard of this? See, Benedict was a great thinker. He was a wonderful teacher and professor, a first-class theologian and philosopher, esteemed in Germany, which is a very rigorous academic climate. And he knew that one of religion's great enemies was that we were caricatured as being against everything. Anything that's enjoyable, the church is against it. Darn it. And the church is about all the church does is say no, no, no to everything. Now, Benedict XVI would remind us, no, the church isn't about one big no. The church, as a matter of fact, is about one big fat yes. And that's affirmative orthodoxy. We're not Puritans, see? The definition of a Puritan is people who just live in mortal fear that somewhere somebody's having a good time. We don't, Catholics are not Puritans, no. And Benedict reminded us of affirmative orthodoxy. He says, the church thunders a yes to everything that is good and true and beautiful and noble and liberating and enlightening in the human project. Everything that is just the best in humanity, the church says, yes, yes, yes. He loved to quote St. Irenaeus, that father of the church, who says, the glory of God is man fully alive, all right? So the church says yes to everything that is good, true, and beautiful in the human project. The church occasionally has to say no whenever the good, the true, and the beautiful is being negated. So the church will occasionally say a no to another no. I don't know about you, but I learned that two no's make a yes. So even in saying no, we end up saying a big fat yes. This is affirmative orthodoxy. So Benedict would say, listen, world, you can look at the church to be your ally in everything that ennobles the human person. The church is the engine of genuine human progress. The church's rich intellectual tradition, it's hardly some dated museum piece, but it's about as timely and as necessary as they come. Number two, Benedict will, every once in a while, when he has to say no to something, and one of the no's he said to, remember, was his famous phrase, the dictatorship of relativism. He says, if we live in a climate, as we do, where there's nothing that you can count on of values and morality, when everything is changing, when everything is up for grabs, where the only constant, unchanging thing in life is my needs, my choices, my conveniences, my future, my wants, my opinions, all right? If that's the only constant in life, we are not free. We are living under a dictatorship of relativism, and we become, as he said in the chilling words delivered at the Bundestag in Berlin, just a couple blocks away from you know what happened, he says, then we become a gang of thugs in a bunker in Berlin, as he recalled the final days of Adolf Hitler, all right? The dictatorship of relativism, that there are, recalling St. Augustine, there are some things that are true, even if the world says they're false, and there are some things that are always false, even if the world thinks they're true, okay? So a no to a dictatorship of relativism. Finally, Benedict XVI will remind us of this alliance of faith and reason that leads us to what he would often call, with the two Latin words, the via media. Via media means the middle way. You see, Benedict would say, as he's talking about the life of the mind, if you look around, you see two extremes. We've been talking about one extreme. That's the extreme where reason alone, our mind alone, and the human brain alone is sufficient. We don't need God's revelation. We don't need the soul. We don't need the faith. We don't need religion. We don't need the church. Reason is enough. And if we can't prove something under a microscope in a laboratory, I'm not going to give it any credibility. That's called rationalism. Rationalism is an extreme, that all we need is the mind. All right? There is another extreme. Those are people who think, I don't care about reason. I don't care about thinking. I don't care about anything human or anything in this life. Faith is enough for me. That's called fideism. All right? And that leads to a fanaticism and an extremism that is as fresh as this morning's paper, where you would see people in the name of religion not tempered by human reason, not thought out with the brains that the good God gave us, leading to violence, horror, terrorism, beheadings. That's fanaticism. That's fideism. Benedict would remind us the Catholic wisdom is the via media. We need them both. Recalling the teaching of St. Anselm, what kind of strange God would we have if his greatest supernatural gift to us, our soul and our faith, is not allied to the greatest natural gift he gives us, our thought and our reason. They are both friends. And Benedict would say the church is at her best when reason and faith are involved in the choreography of a magnificent waltz, where we use all the reasoning and all the power and all the beauty of human reason that the good God gave us. And the light of faith and revelation shines upon it. And when those two come together again, to use a Catholic word, bingo, all right? As John Paul II taught us through his suffering, Benedict will teach us humility by his resignation. Benedict made a different choice than John Paul, didn't he? Benedict said, I am exhausted, I am fragile, my health is broken, I cannot do this after much prayer. And perhaps that was his greatest teaching moment. As he taught us, thank God both popes chose different paths, as we all must do. Where's God want us to be? What's God leading us to do? Benedict simply, humbly said, in the end, it's not about me at all. And the church is going to go on because it's all about Jesus and his church. It's not about me. I've done my best. I've had it for a season. And to serve Jesus and his church best, I must step aside. And that humility, that use of his thinking to arrive at a decision of faith taught us immensely. And finally, folks, Pope Francis, the restoration of the heart of the church. You can kind of read something in names. Benedict, of course, when you think of St. Benedict, you think of, well, you think of St. Benedict. You think of the Benedictines. You think of culture. You think of reason. You think of the monasteries. You think of Western civilization. You think of the power of the mind and the grand tradition of St. Benedict. When Jorge Bergoglio, obviously the first words asked him were, do you accept? And he said yes. And the second word was, by what name will you be chosen? You can't help but wonder, when you're in the conclave, when you kind of think, I wonder what name, and you wonder who it's going to be, and then you wonder what name. And when he said Francis, there was an audible sigh in the room. It was so beautiful, it was so natural. And even in that choice of a name, everybody, Jorge Bergoglio said, it's about the heart. Because when we think of St. Francis, we think of creation, we think of nature, we think of love, we think of reconciliation, we think of music and poetry, we think of service and outreach and compassion to the poor. We think of the heart. So Francis from the beginning led with the heart. Can I tell you a couple stories? I can talk about the conclave because these stories are after he said yes. Immediately they bring him into the room of tears where he changes into his new cassock. It's true, when we went into the Sistine Chapel, we passed through the room of tears and you see the three cassocks. You've heard about that. They've got the three cassocks ready in small, medium, and large. You do. I knew I didn't have a chance when there was no XXL. But there is no big and tall man shop at the Vatican, I guess. Although I love New York. New York has great euphemisms, so the first time when I always go to Penny's or something to shop and I went in to the tailor and I said, "Do you have a big section here?" He said, "Oh, Your Excellency, we call that an executive cut." Well, finally. I was telling when you get these made in Rome, see, and so when I got it made as a Cardinal, they said in Rome, "Oh, we keep your sizes, and then when you need a new one, just call over and we'll make a new one for you and send it over." And I guess he could see my quizzical look, because the tailor in Rome said, "Oh, don't worry, we add an inch every year." Anyway, so when Francis comes back out, okay, now he's in his white cassocks and he kind of stands in front of us and shrugs, and we start to come up. His protocol would be to give him our love and our allegiance, and before we can get up there, he kind of runs down the steps and starts to leave the Sistine Chapel. And we're all thinking, where's he going? There were two cardinals, one with a walker and one with a wheelchair in the back. And he saw them and he immediately went to them. Now, folks, that is about as ordinary and as down to earth as you can get. But I think you'll agree with me that sadly, such ordinary acts of courtesy are rather extraordinary in today's world. And when we saw the Pope do that, there was the heart again. We started coming up, and by that time all the attendants were coming in, and I guess the Pope, we were eager, we had been cut off from the world for those days. In fact, we found out later, Pope Francis, when he went into the room of tears to Vest, there was a phone there, and he said, "I'm going to call Pope Benedict." You know, he shouldn't have to find out about this on CNN or Fox, whichever one he listens to, I don't know. So Pope Francis graciously went to call Benedict, and the line is dead. There's no phones. We couldn't call out or call in. Anyway, he must have, we were asking all the people coming in, "Oh, was there a crowd out there?" "Yeah, there's a big crowd." "Oh, did the smoke work?" Because there was always that work. And then he said, "What's the weather like?" And one of the Swiss guards said, "Oh, it's raining out there." Well, the Pope perked up and he said, "Oh, brothers," he said, "I heard it's raining out there. I'm going to be with you for supper a little while. We can talk then. I can't keep these people waiting. Let's go out and see them." And it's about as simple and down to earth as you can get. But you're seeing from the beginning a man with a heart. We got a Pope with a heart that breaks a tragedy. Remember when he spoke at Lampedusa, where the ship carrying hundreds of refugees from Africa sunk? Remember how on his knees he pleaded with us, with the world, about Syria. We got a Pope with a heart who challenges us to take risks and not be afraid to dream and to dare. We've got a Pope with a heart who is not afraid to speak to us about tenderness. His first Mass was on the Feast of St. Joseph, remember? March 19th. We were wondering what he was going to say. Usually a Pope's first talk is sort of an inaugural address, and we thought, what's Pope Francis going to talk about? And they're usually very diplomatic and very formal. He spoke from the heart. Spoke for 11 minutes. I thought, well, I'm going to like this guy, all right? And do you remember what he said? "I'm calling you to tenderness." He said, "It's the Feast of St. Joseph. Watch how tenderly he carries the baby Jesus. See how tenderly he cherishes his virgin wife. Let God be tender with you. Be tender with one another. Be tender with yourselves, and be tender with creation." When he sat down, I was sitting next to the Archbishop of Vienna, Christoph Schornberg, who's got to be one of the most intelligent cardinals in the college. And he turned to me with tears in his eyes, and he said, "Tim, he speaks like Jesus." I said, "Chris, I think that's the job description." He spoke about tenderness. When that Mass was over, everybody, I had one of these unending press conferences. And if I told you the name of the journalist, you'd recognize it. And as we're getting ready, you wouldn't think she's a spiritual, religious woman. And as we're getting ready, before we went on, she says to me, Cardinal Dolan, Pope Francis spoke about tenderness. She said, I cover every day war and violence, and crime, and terrorism, and famine, and drugs, and abuse. And she said, I come here, and this man speaks about tenderness. She says, do I ever need to hear that? Does the world ever need to hear that? We have, folks, a Pope working on the heart. And we have a Pope who wants to restore the heart of the church. You see, you watch. This is interesting. Pope Francis is always speaking about the church. You can say that John Paul II was so Christological. He was always speaking about Jesus. Benedict was theological, always speaking about God. Francis is ecclesial. He's always speaking about the church. And it reminds us that the church is not some bureaucracy. The church is not a cold institution. The church is not some NGO. The church is not some ethical society. The church is a family. The church is a family with a heart. The church has a father, God. The church as a family has an older brother who's also our Lord and Savior, the way, the truth, and the life, whose sacred heart is the source of our life. The church has a mother. We call her Mary. The church has older ancestors whom we revere, who are saints. The church has brothers and sisters now in the household of the faith. The church is fed at the Sunday table of the Eucharist. The church is where we apologize and receive forgiveness. The church is where we're born in baptism. The church is where we're consoled and healed when we're sick through the sacrament of the anointing of the sick. The church is where we grow to maturity in the sacrament of confirmation. The church is where we make life decisions like marriage or holy orders. The church is a family with a heart. Now, folks, you tell me if we don't need that today, because hear me out. The greatest pastoral challenge, I got 4 minutes. The greatest pastoral challenge today is about the church. If you read the polls, if you read the scientific research, you don't have to do that. If you listen to your kids and grandkids or friends, most of them will tell you, I don't have a problem with God. I don't have a problem with Jesus. I got big time problems with the church. And I don't think I need the church. So we want to be a member of a sheepfold. No, we want Jesus as our shepherd without being a member of the sheepfold. We want Christ as our king without being a member of the kingdom. We want Jesus as our commander, but we don't want to belong to the army. We want God as our father, as long as we're the only child. We want Christ without his church. And Francis tells us, Francis doesn't use theological language. He simply said, to think you can have Christ without his church is stupid. Kind of blunt, okay? Christ and his church are one, Francis tells us. You can't have one without the other. Now, one of the ways he's showing us, 2 ways, I think I got enough time. 2 ways he shows us that the church is a family and that we need the church is by not being afraid to admit that the church is dysfunctional. You see, you hear a lot about dysfunctional families, right? Yeah, have you ever met a dysfunctional family? If you haven't, you're welcome to my house for Thanksgiving. We're all dysfunctional. Every family has its dysfunction, and Francis is saying the church, the family of the church is dysfunctional. We are filled with sinners. We have made blunders. We have hurt people. We have made mistakes because the membership of the church is sinners, is sinful. We are a dysfunctional family, which only shows that we need Jesus, the healer, more and which only leads us to believe that he only comes to us in the church. And then he's secondly saying, this is kind of complex. Number two, secondly, he shows us the church as a family of the heart. He says, you know what is probably good? Let's give people more part of the family first before we start talking to them about doctrine and morals. Now, doctrine and morals are very important. Very important. But let's not lead with those. Let's lead with Jesus Christ and the family of the church. And then once we get them in, then we can talk about faith and morals. Now, he didn't make this one up, everybody. Jesus did it that way. Remember the first apostles? We're talking about the shore of the Sea of Galilee, remember? You're talking about Peter and Andrew, and they're fishermen, and they're sort of fascinated by this preacher. They kind of listen, half-cocked as he's teaching. They're sort of watching, and their fascination is there. And finally, Andrew gets up the courage to say, where do you live? Which they tell us is sort of like the Jewish way of saying, where did you come from? Who do you think you are? Where do you live? Now, how did Jesus respond, remember? Did he say, I am the second person of the most blessed Trinity. I am God from God, true God from true God, begot not made, Nor did he give the Sermon on the Mount and talk about the commandments and the Beatitudes. That'll come later. But what's he say? Come and see. You come and see. You come and get to know me, and your life is never going to be the same. Now, Francis tells us that's the way, that's what we need to do. You ever listen to Father Bob Barron? Yeah. Great. You got to get him here, Bishop. You got to get him here. Father Barron says, see, he runs Mundelein Seminary. Some of your seminarians, where are they? Some of the guys are from Mundelein. He said, apparently Mundelein has a lot of seminarians who are not from the United States. And he says to them, you know what, you guys, I got to teach you baseball, because you can't understand American life unless you understand baseball. So the non-American seminarians will say, okay, Father, tell us the rules. Tell us how baseball is played. He said, no, I'll meet you at 11 o'clock Sunday and we'll go to Wrigley Field. And he says they go to Wrigley Field and they smell the hot dogs and they might have a beer and they're watching batting practice. They admire the crowd. They stand for the national anthem. They're looking around. They're seeing the crowd cheer. And then they get to the beauty and the rhythm and the magic of the game, and they're fascinated. And they start to say, why did he do that? Why didn't he do that? What's that rule about? He gets them into the park, and then he explains the rules. Okay? He says, I don't start by telling them the infield fly ball. He said, I don't understand that. I take them to Wrigley Field, and then I got them caught. Now, Francis is saying that's how we got to do with the church. If they feel welcome, if they come in, if they're fascinated, if they're curious, if they start asking questions, if they start coming back, we got them. And their lives are going to be turned upside down. And then they began to say, tell me the implications, that's faith and morals, of this Jesus and his church that I'm now fascinated with. That's a restoration of the heart of the church. By the way, that's the new evangelization of John Paul II and Benedict XVI. See? That's the chemistry, that's the magic. Upside down. And I'm going to end there, everybody. Soul, head, and heart. John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis. When I was standing there, overlooking the square, with Francis in the balcony, the College of Cardinals behind, I thought of something Cardinal Francis George said, and I love Cardinal George. And he remembered 2005 when he was there standing as Benedict was addressing the crowd. That was in the daylight. So Francis George says, I could look out. And he said, I could see the ruins of the Colosseum that were no more. I could see the ruins of Nero's house that was no more. I could see the pantheon of all the false gods of Rome that was now only a museum. Right? I could see Mussolini's balcony. I could see the Cardinal Palace, where the king of the new United Italy threw the Pope out. He said, I could see all that evidence of all the kingdoms of the world for 2,000 years that thought they were going to have the last word, that thought they were the kingdom, that thought they were going to endure forever, that thought that power and prestige and clout and money and arms and empire and the kingdom of this world was going to dominate, and they are all in ruins. And here is this man who is the successor of the man called Peter, who was crucified upside down a football field away from where we're standing. When he was arrested by Nero in 68, and when they went to crucify him, to murder and torture him the way that Jesus, Peter said, crucify me upside down. And there he is on that hill called the Vatican, upside down. And he's looking at Rome and seeing it upside down. And I'm wondering, folks, if that first pope for the first time finally got it. And remembered back to that day where he met that fisherman, that rabbi on the shore of the Sea of Galilee who said, come and see, and literally turned his life upside down such that he was never the same. And there he is on a cross upside down on a hill called the Vatican. And then we got a John Paul II and a Benedict XVI and a Francis who are turning the world upside down.